Do you think another country like China or Russia is responsible for it?
That's a really interesting question that never gets asked. And okay, you want to go to a really trippy place? So Agnew Bainson, who creates the Institute of Field Physics in the 50s with Bryce DeWitt, the whole purpose of this thing is to study gravity. And, the Chapel Hill Conference in 57, you have Freeman Dyson and John Wheeler and all these, top guys, and they're talking about gravity. And it popularizes quantum gravity and sort of establishes quantum gravity, of which you could say string theory is like the stepchild or whatever. And so Bainson is clearly like funding pretty important stuff in physics. And he writes a fiction novel called The Stars Are Too High. And it is about the creation of this exotic craft by a rogue German faction that the high-ranking Nazi officials weren't even aware of. And I think some of the tech goes to the US and some of the tech goes to Russia. And here's where it just gets really weird. It's like maybe that whole thing is fiction, but if you read The Hunt for Zero Point, the Nick Cook book, which is very, very fact-based and hard-headed, and he shakes out saying, I don't know if the government ever figured out, zero-point energy. He talks about, rumored UFO reverse engineering programs in Germany, where all the first Foo Fighters were seen in 1944, and where Townsend Brown parachutes into under William Donovan and William Stevenson, Bill Donovan, William Stevenson, who create the CIA out of the OSS. They send him to go investigate these sort of anti-gravity programs that the Germans were rumored to have had. And Nick Cook actually even has a really cool documentary on YouTube where he goes and visits the sites where these anti-gravity projects were supposedly rumored to have taken place. There was one with a scientist named Mita and another named Shriver. And I think one was in the northern Germany and the other was in Bavaria. And I think Mita was in Bavaria, if I'm not getting this wrong. And then there's this crazy scavenging from both the Americans and the Russians to get this tech as fast as possible. And the nominal mission on the American side was called TICOM, and they were trying to get this Nazi Enigma machine that was, I think, even more complex than the traditional Enigma machine, and they didn't want the Russians to decipher it first. But there was a whole laundry list of kind of weirder esoteric tech underneath that, and that's what Townsend Brown was presumably. That's why he was parachuting in. Robert Sarbacher was supposedly there as well. And Grush has talked about him being reportedly in the stand-up of, UFO secrecy. So, it's a really interesting question. Did the Russians figure this out too? And then do we have sort of this competing program that, maybe we both took it from the Germans or something. Maybe paperclip was all the more pressing of a need for paperclip because of that history. And Hermann Oberth, who was the original kind of father of German rocketry, he was Werner von Braun's mentor. There are tons of clips of him talking about, UFOs and flying saucers in the sky and ETs. And Werner von Braun was obviously a very trippy guy who talked about entities guiding him to space and was actually very instrumental in the creation of Stargate, which was the CIA's psychic spy program, and wanted to do parapsychology experiments in space, was very into all of that stuff. So it's a weird history, and maybe the Bainson thing is total fiction. Maybe he's hiding reality. Maybe he's hiding truth in fiction. I don't know.
Let's get back to Agnew Bainson. In addition to being an entrepreneur, Agnew was a private pilot with an interest in astronomy. In fact, Agnew was a participant in Operation Moonwatch. So, what is Operation Moonwatch? It was a program led by the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory that encouraged amateur astronomers to track artificial satellites, a pursuit closely tied to the broader Cold War context. In other words, watch the skies. This may have fueled Agnew's and Rogers' fascination with anti-gravity and UFOs. The interest in flying saucers held by both Roger and Agnew seemed eccentric to many, including Wheeler, However, it was Roger and Agnew's willingness to support alternative avenues of research that led to fresh perspectives in gravitational physics, which we now enjoy. Because of the excoriation from Wheeler and others like Martin Gardner, Agnew had developed a protection clause, which would accompany any publicity related to his institute. This clause made it clear that any work conducted at Agnew's institute was not associated with anti-gravity and instead was based on the Newton-Einstein analysis. Despite this, Agnew-Bansen privately remained steadfast in his pursuit of anti-gravity, even exploring the concept of electrogravitics and achieving lift with the help of his collaborator T.T. Brown. It was a claim that piqued the interest of physicists. To verify these claims, Bryce DeWitt and other renowned physicists, like Edward Teller, were called upon to evaluate these devices, though they maintained a scientific stance and noted that the lift was likely due to electrostatic effects. Agnew was, after all, maintaining immense voltages across small distances. In fact, in another unexpected twist to this story, the poster child of string theory, Ed Witten, has a family involvement in this. His father, Louis Witten, was involved with Bansen, stating, "I went to visit him and visited his laboratory, and the basic idea of his laboratory was he had a strong electrostatic field, which was about 150,000 volts over the distance of about a meter. And he had an operator operating this thing, but I knew enough about experiments to know that this was not a very happy place, because I know that for strong electrostatic fields, there shouldn't be any sharp points around. Everything should be curved, and nothing was curved." Louis Witten also indicated that Agnew started the Institute for Field Physics, in particular for Bryce DeWitt. Perhaps he wanted some facade to get physicists like the DeWitts to verify and even build his anti-gravity crafts. Companies like IBM, General Dynamics, and even Glenn Martin Aircraft Manufacturing Company saw potential applications of anti-gravity technologies in their business. These corporations weren't just spectators, they were actively engaged. Actually, it was Glenn Martin that after several mergers became what's now known as Lockheed Martin. Gravitational physics was no longer just an academic pursuit, it had real-world applications that could irrevocably alter industry. You've heard of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. This is the place that was home to some of the greatest minds in history, including Albert Einstein and Curt Gödel. It's also the current home of Ed Witten and Nima Arkani Hamed and Juan Maldacena. Well, Glenn Martin of Lockheed Martin, inspired by Bansen and Babson, aimed to create an industrial version of the Institute for Advanced Study, a place where theoretical discoveries could be applied to solve practical challenges. It was called the RIAS, that is the Research Institute for Advanced Studies, and it was established in 1955. Coming back into the fold, Ed Witten's father, Louis Witten, was not only hired, but helped connect people, organize workshops, and also arranged some of the funding for Glenn Martin's Research Institute at a time when this was extremely uncommon. In fact, Louis Witten was the only one in charge of finding research for the Institute, identifying everyone who could potentially help with Martin's Institute, and hiring them. Even Burkhard Heim was contracted by the RIAS. You may remember Heim from Gary Nolan's podcast on TOE, where Gary talked about Heim's theories.
But basically, this structure that he draws here at the end is a visual representation of how when a certain structure is created, at the top of it, through these levels of organization, consciousness would form because of it. That then you could take away the underlying structure that formed it, and then this would continue to exist independently. If it's right, it means you could create an artificial intelligence, which was in and of itself, could become conscious. Humans might someday be able to, without using biology, but using purely materialistic approaches, build a sufficiently complex machine that creates an object with consciousness and a soul. It's fascinating.
Heim was one of the first, if not the first, to posit that all interactions, gravity, EM, weak, and strong, are unified in a higher dimensional Euclidean space, with extra so-called imaginary dimensions. This was prior even to Yang Mills. Apparently, Hermann Weyl said that the highest chance of anti-gravity lay with Heim's theories, but unfortunately, after several attempts, I wasn't able to track down this source. If someone viewing this has the source of the text on screen, then please let me know and place it in the comments. While it wasn't said publicly, it was known through the grapevine that the Glenn Martin Company was interested in anti-gravity. Recall, you can think of the Glenn Martin Company as the predecessor to Lockheed Martin. In Witten's words, there was a new thing in the wind at the time, which was anti-gravity. It was in the wind. I quickly learned that I should talk about gravity and that they would ask me about anti-gravity. And I'd say, well, we just learned about gravity. If there's anything to anti-gravity, it'll come along. MIT professor of the history of science, David Kaiser, along with University of Sydney professor of philosophy and physics, Dean Rickles, cataloged this, and the links are in the description, as well as links to all sources. Now, if this wasn't convoluted enough, Witten explicitly commented on potential anti-gravity materials, saying a guy in France was discovering that on the night of a new moon, a pendulum swung faster or slow. A guy named Townsend discovered that there was a type of bismuth that was repelled instead of attracting.
The first astrophysics symposium not only started this field of relativistic astrophysics, but it ended a chapter which is a sort of interesting small chapter in the history of relativity. I'm referring to the worldwide craze that lasted for about 10 years in the discovery of anti-gravity. And I bring that in because that impacted on my life quite considerably. In the middle 1950s, I found myself after a different, I should say, youth than one might expect, employed by the Martin Company, now the Lockheed Martin Company, which was mentioned by the dean earlier. In the mid-1950s then, I found myself employed at the Martin Company with a rather weak PhD, I would say, at the age of about 35, with a few children. There was a vice president of ideas. That was not his title, but his function was to bring the company into new eras. The company was building airplanes and building rockets. It ultimately built the Titan rocket, which was used for many space vehicle flights. The vice president had the idea, which was to him a wonderful idea, to develop anti-gravity. Of course, when he tried the idea in public, you can imagine the greeting he received by the scientists.